Welcome back to the DGNB Annual Congress, and then what you just hear. I'm still talking in English, like for the last lecture, and for the last lecture we were 7 hours already ahead of German time, and now we're 6 hours behind German time, because even if you introduced our next lecturer with her institute that is located in London, but now we move over to the US, to New York, and I'm pretty happy to welcome you, Annabel, to have you at this very, very early time for giving us your lecture. Let me shortly introduce you to Annabel. Annabel has 2 decades of experience on human rights, on climate change and business at the international and the local level. So she's quite experienced in the special topic that we did not aim too often when in our discussions about sustainability in the built environment, which is the human rights and dignity behind it. She's here today in her role as a research fellow with the Institute for Human Rights and Business, which is with a headquarters located in London, but has people working all over the globe. You are located in New York, so you have this overall view on what's going on, and also the discussions on human rights in terms of the built environment. Annabel, we're so happy that you are here today, and for the next 30 minutes, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and I just wanted to check you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak at DGNB's Annual Congress this year. And over the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be shining a light both on the why keeping people and focusing on the social dimensions within climate action in the built environment is important, and equally unpacking what this means in practice, both for industry and for investors. Given the audience here, my remarks will have a strong European lens, but will also be drawing on global perspectives as well. And I just thought I would start with why embed a social lens as well. I was in a session the other day, and there was a founder of a climate tech company, and his perspective was, our remit is climate change, and it's just too much for us to be thinking about the social impacts as well. That I absolutely understand. I think people are not able to tackle all the social impacts in the built environment, obviously, as single institutions. At the same time, there are very compelling reasons why it's important to think about climate action through a social lens. One being that climate action on its own brings risks of only benefiting the few, deepening inequality between countries and also within countries and cities. This also brings risks, obviously, of continued pushback towards climate policies, which actually slows down action. Without thinking of the social side, there's also a risk there isn't the workforce to carry out the necessary work and the shifts in industries that are necessary for the climate transition. And finally, actually coming at climate from a social lens can actually unlock action on the climate side as well, in terms of thinking about existing buildings that need to be retrofitted, thinking about how to reimagine supply chains so that they're not as international and extractive, but fostering local economies and creating workforce opportunities, etc. And then in terms of the more specific why, from a business perspective, there's the mitigating risks of project delays, of tenant turnover, of supply chain disruptions. There are the increasing legal expectations, such as the fact that the existing EU taxonomy includes social safeguard provisions, and there are conversations about an expanded social taxonomy. There is the opportunity to be reaching consumers and meeting their actual needs in their daily lives, and obviously also recruiting and retaining talent, as many people who are entering these industries are thinking both of climate dimensions and the social impacts of their work. At the Institute, a big focus of our work has been on a just transition within the built environment and unpacking really what this means in practice for industries working within the built environment. And we've developed 2 transition pathways, one which could go the route of failing to take social dimensions into account, and the other that really takes the lens of how do we ensure a just and fair transition as we mitigate against carbon emissions and strengthen climate resilience in the built environment. And hone in on 3 areas. So, for example, in the area of materials, you could envision a future in which the transition is heavily dependent on continued extraction of the materials necessary for it. Copper, for example. It's striking that the University of Queensland has come out with statistics around the so far untapped copper reserves globally, for example, finding that 65% are in or close to Indigenous owned land. Very high percentages are in water stressed areas, for example. Conversely, there's opportunities when we think about materials in terms of how do we foster and incubate sustainable materials, localized production, the job creation that comes with it. On the energy side, as buildings shift to sourcing from renewable energy, there are similar issues around displacement for expansion of renewable energy sources that have been highlighted over the years since renewable forms of energies have been expanded. At the same time, there's also risks as renovations take place, that then the cost for tenants increases, which again leads to the pushback. So factoring in the rights, the perspectives, the economics and the daily lives of tenants, and ensuring that the policies are in place to do that from the outset can then ensure that the energy transition benefits populations as widely as possible. Finally, on the resilience side, what a lens that's important is thinking about which parts of cities, which areas are receiving investments in resilience. Are we protecting all areas of cities? And what are the ways that we can be sure we're drawing on natural infrastructure and the opportunities to bring broad-based health, natural world benefits at the same time as we think about resilience. I think another point that I sometimes hear is there's a lot more clarity around emissions, and they're easier to measure, and the business case is there, the incentives are there, and it's much clearer than on the social side. I thought I'd just hone in briefly on the way in which the social outcomes are grounded in international standards, which are the most powerful reference points in terms of taking action. So, for example, in addition to the Paris Agreement, having a reference to just transition, the 2023 stocktake that came out of UAE this year calls for a fossil fuel phase out in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. The SDGs themselves call for the need for safe, resilient, and sustainable cities and human settlements, and then Target 11.1 that sits under that is around the access to affordable and adequate housing, for example. The ILO has issued just transition guidelines, which the majority of governments reinforced their support of at COP last year, which call for maximizing the social and economic opportunities of climate action while minimizing and carefully managing any challenges. And then finally, there's the Global Human Rights Framework, which the Institute's program is grounded in. And I think what's important to lift up here is often people have ideas around which are the topics that human rights prioritize, often with an emphasis, for example, on working conditions through global supply chains, on displacement. And I think what's important to emphasize here is the wide spectrum of human rights and quite how much substance there is behind human rights standards, whether it is rights such as the right to adequate housing, to physical and mental health, workers' rights, participation, non-discrimination. So it's a very clear framework from which to ensure you're integrating the social dimensions of climate action. Also accompanied, of course, with its regional frameworks and touch points. So, for example, you have the EU's pillar of social rights within Europe. Just to touch on some really high-level elements of how to go about integrating the social dimensions of climate action, I think this lens of both managing risks but also harnessing opportunities is really important. There's what I refer to as the procedural dimensions, which include those cross-cutting rights of participation and of non-discrimination in terms of who's actually engaged and has a stake in the process. And then there is the area of shifting business models and investment. How can the green transition actually enable business models that are fundamentally rethinking some of the ways that business works, unlocking opportunities, and ensuring more sustainable models looking forward into the future. That first half was quite big picture. I'm now going to hone in a little bit more on some specific recommendations and angles for different actors around the built environment lifecycle. So the Institute has developed what it calls its framework for dignity in the built environment, which elevates social risks and opportunities from the earliest stages right through to the end of the built environment lifecycle, and really hones in on what are the leverage points that different actors have. I think one of the key points to lift up here is, no actor is going to solve these issues alone, but everybody has certain roles that they play within the ecosystem, and then certain leverage points over others, starting, of course, with the regulatory frameworks, the planning frameworks in which business operates, thinking about the role that investors play in terms of how they're investing their money and engaging companies. And then on the project side, thinking about the leveraging roles of the different actors involved in specific building projects. And at the center, with the actual users of spaces, the tenants of buildings, the workers who are working on construction sites or designing the buildings that they're working on. So in terms of steps that industry can take, the Institute's guidelines unpack this in far more detail, but this is to really elevate the angles that I think are helpful to be thinking about in terms of embedding just transition and the social dimensions from the industry perspective. First, thinking of quite how important it is for board level leadership. This could include ensuring that there's expertise on human rights and the social dimensions within the board itself, or ensuring that there are processes by which the risks and opportunities of climate action that are material both within the company itself and to people who are impacted by its operations are taken into account at a senior level. And the other point I'd lift up there is, embedding social dimensions into business strategy. I think there's a risk as there's growing reporting expectations that then climate action and just transition can start becoming seen as a compliance exercise, and with the reporting driving the strategy. And obviously it's important for the strategy itself to be mapping out, okay, as there's a demand for more affordable housing in multiple cities across Europe, how can we as a company be harnessing that demand and helping contribute to its expansion in partnership with others and ensuring that that housing is low carbon, energy efficient, etc. At the project level, the framework for dignity maps out from the very earliest stages of a project the risks and opportunities. And I think the slogan, almost as it were, for the whole program is the earlier action, the better. So taking and investing that time at the very earliest stages of a project to think about how can this project really manage those social risks and maximize opportunities. The framework has been picked up in cities in Europe and beyond, for example. So the city of Bergen in Norway is integrating it in a specific project, and the city of Utrecht is also taking it on board in a project there as well. On the supply chain side, some of the leverage points is obviously like specification of materials and factoring in as we're thinking about which materials are going to be used. Are there risks of forced labor abuses through this material supply chain? Are there ways that we can be innovating in the ways that materials are used and in the workforces that will be developing them, and tracking and telling the stories as this shift happens. And then finally, on the policy side, which links in many ways back to board level leadership and embedding the social dimensions in strategy, is thinking about the ways in which the company is engaging policymakers to try and expand the space to do this right, to increase the incentives, and engaging in leadership groups. One example of that, for example, is the Design for Freedom group, which is based actually out here from the US, but is expanding globally, which is bringing together architecture and engineering and construction companies thinking about how they manage risks to workers through their supply chains. So on the investment side, I'd say that two of the points from the industry side are equally relevant here in terms of board level and senior leadership, and in terms of the approach to specific projects that investors may be investing in. Just to elevate some other dimensions here on the investor side, there is growing thinking and action around systems level investing and taking a long-term view. So thinking about not investment by investment so much, but rather the spectrum across the companies and industries that investors are investing in, and thinking more systemically, what are the climate and social risks that need to be managed? This geomapping, I know that PGGM and Munich Re, for example, has a lot of experience mapping the climate resilient risks for its real estate investments. And I think there's a huge opportunity here to be combining thinking, okay, what are the risks here for climate and what are the risks for people? And how do those then have feedback loops that can impact our investments and sustainability over time? There are obviously many opportunities to be engaging companies that investors invest in on social environmental risk and strategy. Partnerships, public-private partnerships have been around for quite a long time. I think as we're thinking about addressing the climate crisis and the complex ecosystem that I highlighted earlier, it's becoming more and more important for finance on the private side, as well as governments to be partnering on these issues. Yeah, it's like a municipality is saying, okay, over the next 30 years, our vision is to reduce emissions from buildings and also to expand people's access to affordable housing. How can we be bringing in the finance that's necessary to make this happen? And then similarly with industry on the policy side, engaging collectively with other companies and also through public policy practice to help expand the space for action in this area. Many of you may have seen, for example, that London School of Economics recently launched a Just Transition Finance Lab, which is really bringing together investors to think through what does a just transition mean for us as investors, and how do we enable more forward movement. Finally, just to share a couple of the resources, some of the resources that the Institute has put together. These are some of the foundational reports for the program. There is the Dignity by Design, Human Rights Around the Built Environment Lifecycle, which is the grounding report for the whole program, and Better Buildings, which really hones in on specific recommendations for policymakers and for investors in the built environment in Europe, lifting up the themes I highlighted earlier: housing, workers' rights, physical and mental health. Apologies, just having an issue on my slide deck here. There we go. There should be a QR code now appearing on the screen. We're in the process of developing a course on human rights in the built environment, which will be a professional certificate with the support of the Ove Arup Foundation, in order to provide interdisciplinary education around managing human rights risks and opportunities in the built environment, and also an economic innovation map highlighting some of the advances in new business models in the built environment to enable a just transition. And the QR code links through to just a simple web page where you can access some of the resources all in one place. And finally, thank you, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in the backstage room.
Thanks, Annabel. I guess we can find out the link to the course later and put it in the chat, be it here on the main stage or in the backstage room. As you were quite quick, we still have some time here on the main stage to discuss between the two of us. So when you published this framework for dignity, what was the reaction? Everyone's saying, "Oh, okay, cool. I've heard that it's good. It's the next point." Has someone waited for it, or did they say, "Okay, stay in your direction, but we'll act as we always did"?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think it's been very much welcomed in terms of bringing clarity to the social dimensions. I think often there's that sense of, okay, we know that the human rights side needs to be managed, but the question is the how. And so I think a lot of enthusiasm around the clarity that it brings and the way in which it unpacks the different roles of different actors. I think also there can be a sense of, as I highlighted at the beginning, this is overwhelming. This is a broad spectrum of issues. We can't act on all of them. And in that sense, I think that's where it really comes back to business strategy and honing in on what are the really salient priority issues that are relevant to us as a business to be elevating within our core strategy and moving on those while managing any key risks in the other areas.
When talking on these social aspects, as you know, and you focused on Europe somehow, there's this big ESG discussion on, everyone knows about the E, about the environmental aspects, but bringing it to the built environment, a lot of companies, people, also governments struggle on how the social issues should be defined or measured and so on. And so, for example, we at DGNB, we're just about to start a study with a GIF, with a real estate institute, a research institute here, for residential buildings, go much more in detail about the social aspects. Do you follow this discussion, and do you bring in some insights from your point of view into this ESG social discussion?
Exactly. Yes, that is the role of the Institute's Europe team. So that's very much the approach that the team is bringing, is engaging in those different spaces to help bring clarity and also consistency across the board. And as I highlighted, it's actually not new. The human rights standards, on which the safeguards in the EU taxonomy, for example, are based on, have been around and developed over several years, and provide a lot of substance. So, for example, in the area of housing, there are core elements of the right to housing, which include that it is adequate, that it is affordable, that it is habitable in terms of, the continued maintenance over time. So continuing to keeping those core elements in mind can really help clarify, what the S within the ESG is. I think one of the points to really lift up there too, two other points perhaps. I feel like during the COVID pandemic, there was a recognition of quite how central the places that we live, like the rooms that we're in, the green space we have access to, is to, in that case, in many ways, like our survival and levels of risk in terms of mental and physical health. And I think it's really important to keep that close in mind, that this isn't sort of an abstract requirement. It's actually about, the spaces that we have in, the really big disparities around who has access to what kinds of spaces. And there's growing recognition, I think, of quite how powerful, influential, and crucial the built environment and how it's designed is to people's well-being. And just holding that sort of very practical human dimension close in mind in acting on the social, I think, is really important. Rather than saying, hey, this is another requirement that we need to be thinking about. It's just part of designing a space that works for people now, but also into the future. And then the other element I lifted up earlier is, and I think it's increasingly happening, which is good, is really ensuring that E, S, and G aren't operating along parallel tracks. So recognizing that action on both of those requires effective governance to move forward effectively. And without the effective governance, you can't move on both. Or as I highlighted at the beginning too, that any action on emissions and on resilience brings risks and opportunities as well on the social side.
So when you started, I always tell the same as, I'm responsible for communication at DGNB, and if we have the issue that now we have the figures, so you need to be climate neutral until 2030 with the new buildings, 2045 with the existing buildings. And then I always also in our presentation, I bring in this chart where I say, okay, but we should not only look on those two figures, but at least the main aim is that we have this quality of life been given, and we should take care of that. Nevertheless, in the discussions now, as we have this multiple crises and so on, it's pretty much that only sustainability and affordable are brought against each other, and the other social aspects, it seems for me, in the discussions are more in the background. Do you see it in a similar way, and do you think that this focus on the affordable side on social is helpful, or is it more misleading?
I mean, I think affordability is one factor that links to so many of the others in terms of, the amount of space that people are able to live in, their experience when they're living in their places. So I think it is in many regions, and including in Europe, being elevated as one of the core issues, almost up there with the climate crisis in terms of what needs to be tackled. So I do think that it's an important focus, but ensuring that it's connected into the wider elements of the right to adequate housing as well. And underpinning that really is the right to non-discrimination. So ensuring that the benefits of green buildings are actually felt widely and experienced widely, and not only by a few who are able to afford them. And I think in order to enable that to happen, that certainly requires policy interventions in terms of affordability, and also thinking about the areas in which investments in green buildings and infrastructure take place. We've done some mapping actually of the way in which the focus on green building and the investment that's flowing in is inherently very focused in city centres, for example, which then can, risk sort of increasing disparities within cities. So
overall, when you think about the way you're working and try to make your impact, what would you say? What are the most important partners for your work? Or maybe what should be even more important partners in the future to really bring your messages and bring your aims to reality?
That is an excellent question. And actually the program began with conversations with architects and construction companies saying we'll want to be taking action on the social dimensions, but until our clients, whether that's public sector clients on the municipal side or private sector clients, are sort of requiring this and incentivizing it, our scope for action is limited. So our primary audiences are both the policymakers who need to be enabling and moving and shaping this work forward, but also investors. So what's the role of pension funds, of sovereign wealth funds, of banks, of others? How do we really sort of think about the financial dimensions within the built environment and strengthen awareness around the breadth of ESG issues and the way in which finance can become as much as possible an enabling factor for just transition within the built environment. So any investors across the spectrum of public and private investment who are here and are listening, we're very much interested in opening conversations with as many on the finance side as possible.